It was a chilly morning in March of 1603, and the courtiers were deep within Richmond Palace when they made a discovery that would send chills down their spines. A letter was found among the personal belongings of England's most powerful king. The contents of the letter were so upsetting that they were quickly sealed away from public view. Queen Elizabeth I, sometimes known as the Virgin Queen, had ruled England for 45 years when she passed away under circumstances that were significantly more ominous than what is allowed to be revealed in history textbooks. The information that they discovered in that letter would imply that her death was not the tranquil passing of an aged monarch, but rather the culmination of decades of slow and purposeful poisoning, maybe by her own hand. A lady who had fought the Spanish Armada, who had made England into a maritime power, and who had given her name to an entire age, had spent her final years as a prisoner of her own vanity. She had given her name to an entire age. It's possible that the makeup she employed to keep her famous beauty could have been the very thing that led to her downfall. On the other hand, the truth behind Elizabeth's death goes much further than cosmetic poisoning. It delves into the most obscure recesses of Tudor politics, where survival meant lying, and where even queens were not immune from those who claimed to serve them. There is a difference between this and the Gloriana story that you studied in school. It is the story of a lady who is caught between the unattainable demands of power and femininity, and whose frantic efforts to maintain her image may have resulted in the loss of everything she owns. There is evidence to suggest that Elizabeth I did not merely pass away. Rather, she was slowly murdered, maybe as a result of her own choices, in one of the most drawn-out and terrible deaths in the annals of history. The road that led Elizabeth Tudor to the throne was literally paved with blood. Beginning at the moment of her conception, Elizabeth entered a world in which the very existence of her was seen as illegitimate by a significant portion of Europe. She was born to Henry VII and Anne Boleyn, who was his second wife. The desperate search for a male successor that her father had been conducting had already caused England to be severed from the Catholic Church and had thrown the country into a state of theological upheaval. Elizabeth saw her mother being murdered in a methodical manner while she was only a young child of 2 years old. This event would remain a source of utmost distress for her throughout her entire life. It was not a speedy process when Anne Boleyn was put to death in the year 1536 and was portrayed as an adulteress, a witch, and a traitor by Henry VIII, who was determined to justify his actions. Henry VIII conducted a campaign of character assassination that created this impression. The young Elizabeth was present when her mother was deprived of her title, her marriage was pronounced invalid, and her very existence was removed from official records. Both of these events occurred simultaneously. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was carried to the gallows in the Tower of London, where a French swordsman who had been specifically imported for the occasion cut her head with a single blow. Elizabeth, who had been pronounced illegitimate, found herself suddenly without a mother and without a title. She was entirely dependent on her father, who had demonstrated that he would kill his own women. It is impossible to emphasize the psychological impact that this traumatic event had. Elizabeth grew raised with the knowledge that her father had been responsible for the death of her mother, and that the fact that she was born was the impetus for her mother's passing. She was aware that her own safety was totally dependent on her capacity to satisfy a man who was capable of ordering the killing of people whom he had previously claimed to love. During their time at the Tudor court, children were taught that love was fleeting, that power was paramount, and that even the most intimate connections may turn lethal without any prior warning. These lessons were only reinforced by Henry's future marriages and divorces when they occurred. During the time that Elizabeth was present, her father wed Jane Seymour, who later passed away while giving birth to Edward, the long-awaited male heir. She was there throughout the rapid annulment of Henry's marriage to and of Cleves and the horrible death of Catherine Howard, her fifth stepmother, who was brought screaming to the block for supposed infidelity. Both of these events took place around the same time period. As Elizabeth went through each marriage, divorce, and execution, she learned that in order to survive in the Tudor realm, she needed to maintain a state of perpetual alertness and complete control. By becoming an expert in deception, The little princess was able to acquire the skills necessary to successfully traverse this perilous environment. Her academic performance was exceptional, and she became fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. She was well aware that intelligence was the one weapon that could be relied upon. While she was privately challenging the legitimacy of all religious authorities, she worked to build an appearance of Protestant piety. The most important thing that she did was learn to read the subtle signs of court politics. She realized that her life could depend on her ability to decipher a glance, a gesture, or a carefully selected remark. Elizabeth had already mastered the talents that would serve her well as queen by the time Henry VIII passed away in 1547. These skills included the capacity to present many faces to different audiences, the knack for talking a lot while revealing nothing, and the understanding that authority requires the perpetual threat of violence. She had realized that being a woman in a position of authority meant that she was always under suspicion, and that in order to survive, she had to give up her own goals in order to fulfill the requirements of the political system. Her youth was marked by traumatic experiences, which laid the groundwork for everything that would come after. The lessons that Elizabeth learnt in those early blood-soaked years, when she found that even royal parents might become executioners, ultimately led to her terrible final years. Her later fixation with her attractiveness, her refusal to marry, her neurotic devotion to loyalty, and finally her catastrophic final years. In October of 1562, when she was 29 years old, Queen Elizabeth I was confronted with the smallpox epidemic that would prove to be the defining crisis of her reign. This incident also marked the beginning of her gradual spiral into vanity, which would ultimately lead to her death. It was with a devastating force that the young queen was hit by the disease that had already taken the lives of countless people across Europe. While she was lying in Hampton Court Palace, her body was raging with fever, and her advisors were muttering about succession in the corridors outside her chamber. She was in a state of near death for several days. When Elizabeth was eventually able to escape from the crisis, she found out that the cancer had left her with something that was far more devastating than physical scars. It had destroyed the one thing that she cherished above all else, her legendary beauty. Elizabeth had suffered severe facial damage as a result of the smallpox, which had left deep pock marks all over her skin, notably on her. In a time when the appearance of a monarch was thought to be a reflection of divine favor, the forehead and cheeks were regarded most important. The ugliness in question was not only a matter of appearance. Rather, it was a political disaster. Elizabeth had utilized her beauty as one of her most powerful diplomatic instruments, using it to deceive foreign embassies and to preserve the pretense that she may marry in order to gain alliances. In European courts, she was described as having skin as white as snow and a countenance that appeared to radiate with an inner light. That woman had vanished without a trace. The psychological repercussions of this change are absolutely not something that can be reduced. Elizabeth had grown up with the realization that her power was precarious, and that it was contingent on her ability to strike a careful balance between being attractive enough to attract suitors and independent enough to resist getting married. The beauty that she possessed had served as her defense, her weapon, and her shield. Unable to access it, she had feelings of vulnerability that extended far beyond the physical realm. Observers of the court remarked that after the queen had recovered, she developed an increased preoccupation with mirrors. She would spend hours each day analyzing her reflection and trying with various cosmetic procedures. Elizabeth was exposed to the lead-based cosmetics for the first time during this time period, which would ultimately prove to be responsible for her death. The Venetian ceruse, which was a mixture of white lead and vinegar, made the claim that it could produce a complexion that was light and flawless, which was considered to be the pinnacle of fashion among European nobles. In addition to being prohibitively pricey and exclusive, the material was so adept at concealing flaws that it was disastrous. When it was used in sufficient quantities, it had the ability to totally conceal the pockmarks that the smallpox had left behind, so producing an artificial smoothness that was reminiscent of her previous attractiveness. After some time had passed, Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting detailed the complex routine that accompanied the Queen's daily application of makeup. On a daily basis, she would relax for a considerable amount of time, as multiple layers of ceruse were meticulously applied to her face, neck, and hands. In order to reach the appropriate level of opaqueness, the method in question was laborious and required numerous coatings. On top of this foundation, other cosmetics were applied, including kohl around the eyes, rouge derived from mercury sulfide on the lips and cheeks, and delicately painted embellishments to highlight her features. At first glance, the findings were absolutely astounding. Elizabeth's appearance was once again lauded by ambassadors from other countries, who remarked on her ethereal beauty and the alabaster color of her complexion. During this time, European princes were competing with one another for the hand of the Virgin Queen, which led to the resurrection of marriage talks. Elizabeth had been able to successfully restore her political power through the use of chemical. However, she had also initiated a process that would continue to gradually poison her body. The unfortunate aspect of Elizabeth's post-smallpox makeover was that it took place over the course of 40 years, and it was successful to an excessive degree. Using cosmetics containing lead, she was able to conceal her wounds while simultaneously creating an image of otherworldly perfection that became an essential part of her royal character. She was unable to stop using the makeup without exposing the injured skin that lay behind it, and she was unable to continue using it without exposing herself to daily dosages of hazardous metal. She prioritized her appearance over her health. As a result of her preference for political power over her physical well-being, Elizabeth was destined to die a slow and excruciating death. Something that started out as a cosmetic treatment to cover up scars from smallpox quickly turned into something much more sinister, a daily ritual of self-poisoning that would continue for 40 years. Elizabeth's makeup procedure, which courtiers claimed as lasting up to 4 hours each morning, involved the systematic application of ingredients that current science considers as among the most toxic poisons known to humans. Elizabeth's makeup routine was described as being quite comprehensive. Lead amounts that would horrify modern toxicologists were found in the Venetian ceruse that served as the foundation of her look. Additionally, the extra cosmetics that were placed on top of it added mercury, arsenic, and other potentially lethal substances into her system. The fact that the lead in ceruse was absorbed directly through the skin and then accumulated in the tissues of the body over time made it an especially sneaky and dangerous substance. Chronic lead exposure, on the other hand, causes a gradual decline in mental and physical function that might take decades to become apparent, in contrast to acute poisoning, which causes symptoms to appear almost immediately. The fact that Elizabeth applied heavy layers of lead-based cosmetics on a regular basis meant that she was absorbing dosages of this deadly metal that were significantly higher than what would be considered safe, even for industrial workers in the present era. There were stories from the present day that described the Queen's makeup as being so heavy that it looked more like a mask than it did like conventional cosmetics. In the presence of candlelight, Elizabeth's face appeared to be carved from marble, with an unnatural smoothness that seemed to glow. This was seen by those who frequently visited the court. The effect was accomplished by applying many layers of ceruse, each one building upon the previous one to produce a surface that was almost identical to that of porcelain. As a result of the widespread association that this mask-like appearance had with Elizabeth, many of her people had never seen her face in its natural state. The psychological reliance that formed as a result of this cosmetic practice was just as deadly as the physical poisoning that occurred. After some time, Elizabeth came to the realization that her authority and legitimacy were contingent upon her ability to maintain this fake look. During her final years, she insisted that all photographs depict her with a flawless, ageless face that was made by her makeup. She prohibited the development of realistic portraits under any circumstances. It was not artistic norms that were responsible for the proliferation of youth pictures throughout the later decades of her reign. Rather, it was planned propaganda that was aimed to disguise the reality of her failing condition. As Elizabeth grew older and the consequences of lead poisoning became more obvious, the application process itself became more complicated and involved more steps. during the course of her natural skin becoming more damaged and discolored. Her ladies-in-waiting stated that the queen required ever heavier applications of ceruse in order to get the appropriate impression. What was once a few coats of makeup became into a construction project, with cosmetics applied so thickly that they would crack and flake during the day, necessitating continuous touch-ups and repairs. This was a problem because it was a construction project. The financial burden that this cosmetic process imposed was just astonishing. Elizabeth imported the best pearls from Venice and unique pigments from all over the known world in order to purchase her cosmetics materials, which cost her the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's currencies. Both the rising quantities of cosmetics that were required to maintain the illusion of youth and beauty, as well as the fact that the queen placed a great amount of importance on her looks, were reflected in the fact that the cosmetic expenses of the queen constituted a significant component of the royal budget. The most terrible aspect of the situation was that Elizabeth appeared to be aware of the potentially harmful effects of her beauty practice, yet she felt helpless to terminate it. As news surfaced about the deaths of other noblewomen from cosmetic poisoning, several of her closest advisors, notably William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, pushed her to minimize the amount of cosmetics she used. This was especially true in light of the situations described in the reports. The response that Elizabeth always gave was the same. She could not appear before her subjects or foreign dignitaries without her face, which she referred to as her makeup. In her role as queen, the artificial appearance had become so integral to her identity that removing it would have been the same as stepping down from the throne itself. As the extent of Elizabeth's reliance on cosmetics containing lead increased, the royal court morphed into a weird theater of deception, where it became increasingly difficult to differentiate between fact and play. The queen's rising self-consciousness about her appearance resulted in the construction of specially crafted mirrors around her palaces. These mirrors had surfaces that had been discreetly bent or tinted to present a more favorable reflection of the queen. These mirrors, which were made by Venetian artists at an extraordinary price, established an environment in which Elizabeth could continue to preserve the illusion that her cosmetic metamorphosis was succeeding, even as her natural appearance degraded beneath the toxic mask. The psychological effects of chronic lead poisoning began to appear in Elizabeth's behavior throughout the 1580s. However, courtiers attributed her increasingly erratic behavior to the difficulties of ruling at this time period. The signs of lead poisoning, which often include irritability, memory loss, difficulty concentrating, and moments of confusion, became increasingly obvious in the elderly queen. Lead poisoning is a type of poisoning that is commonly found in animals. Her well-known outbursts of fury, which had previously been deliberate demonstrations of royal authority, morphed into unpredictably explosive outbursts of rage that worried even her most loyal advisors. It appeared as though Elizabeth was unable to break free from the daily routine of putting her cosmetics, which she considered to be a type of torture. The process that her ladies-in-waiting described was one that was not only physically difficult, but also emotionally devastatingly awful. The lead-based Susie caused her skin to become red and irritated, which necessitated the use of additional makeup in order to disguise the redness. Both headaches and difficulty expressing facial expressions were brought on by the weight of the cosmetics, which were applied in layers that were so thick that they resembled plaster. The once famous smile of Elizabeth, which was once regarded as bright and attractive, transformed into a stiff scowl that was maintained by sheer force of will. While the queen's efforts to maintain her youthful appearance became increasingly frantic and odd, she continued to make them. She began experimenting with different methods of cosmetic application. The application of raw flesh to her face as a purported anti-aging therapy and the utilization of mercury-based chemicals that promised to restore her natural complexion were two of the things that bordered on the obscene in this situation. In addition to the poisonous weight that her body was already bearing, these treatments, which were suggested by court physicians who had a limited understanding of the chemistry involved, further added to the strain. Ambassadors from other countries started making troubling remarks about Elizabeth's behavior and appearance. According to the observations made by the Venetian ambassador, The queen's hands were shaking continually. Her speech was occasionally slurred, and it seemed as though her memory was falling apart. Even more concerning was the fact that he noted that her makeup had started to take on a greenish hue, which indicated that the chemical reactions that were taking place on her face were evident even through the thick layers of cosmetics that she was wearing. Elizabeth's diplomatic authority began to be undermined as a result of these reports, which were distributed across European courts. Foreign countries began to question whether or not she was mentally and physically capable of reigning. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this time period was Elizabeth's increasing sense of loneliness. Her conduct became increasingly erratic, and her appearance became more artificial. As a result, she started to retreat from public appearances and restrict access to her private chambers. The Queen, who had formerly flourished on public admiration and diplomatic intrigue, eventually turned into a recluse, only coming out for the most important functions of the state responsibilities. Even at that time, she insisted on making her appearances in settings with low lighting, so that the full degree of her cosmetic alteration would be less immediately evident. An intricate system of rules was developed by the court in response to Elizabeth's deteriorating condition. These procedures were aimed to safeguard both the Queen's dignity and the safety of the courtiers. Specified regulations dictated the extent to which individuals were permitted to approach the Queen, the appropriate lighting for the audience, and the topics of conversation that were permitted. Despite the fact that these norms were presented as concerns of royal etiquette, they were primarily safety measures designed to prevent circumstances in which Elizabeth's health may become evident to visitors or where her increasingly unpredictable conduct might generate disastrous occurrences. In the 1590s, the cumulative effects of 4 decades of lead poisoning had begun to change Elizabeth I from England's most formidable monarch into a tragic character whose grasp on reality was gradually slipping away. This transformation began while Elizabeth I was already a formidable monarch. Despite the fact that she had formerly been able to demand respect due to her excellent intellect and political skill, the Queen was now having difficulty with fundamental cognitive functions. Her closest advisors found themselves in the position of governing not just a kingdom, but also an increasingly unstable monarch whose decisions could no longer be trusted. This was despite the fact that the intricate court protocols that surrounded her made it difficult for anybody to determine the full depth of her deterioration. The physical manifestations of chronic lead poisoning had reached a point where they could no longer be concealed. Elizabeth's hands, which were once acclaimed for their grace, now trembled frequently, a condition that her physicians attributed to a nervous disposition. This situation occurred despite the fact that she applied multiple layers of cosmetics every morning. In the field of contemporary medicine, which of the following would be considered a classic indicator of heavy metal toxicity? Her gait, which had been regarded as graceful and powerful in the past, had become wobbly, and she needed to grab onto furniture or courtiers for support. She was forced to rely on increasingly extravagant wigs in order to keep up her public look, which was the most unsettling aspect of the situation. Her famed red hair had started to fall out in little spots. Even further concerning signs of mental decline were observed in the Queen's condition. Sometimes she would forget the names of lifelong courtiers, and other times she would become confused about fundamental knowledge about the administration. One of the most unsettling incidents occurred when Elizabeth was discovered in her private apartments, where she was talking animatedly to her reflection in a mirror. It appeared that Elizabeth was under the impression that she was having a conversation with her mother and Bullen. The occurrence of such occurrences became more regular as the decade passed, despite the fact that they were carefully disguised from all members of her home, with the exception of the most trusted individuals. The manner in which Elizabeth engaged in interactions with her courtiers became increasingly unpredictable and occasionally aggressive. Whenever she became angry over something as insignificant as a minor issue, she would strike her servants with her hands or whatever was within her grasp. These outbursts were followed by moments of profound melancholy, during which she would stay silent for days at a time and refuse to communicate with anyone. The natural aging process, in conjunction with the psychological symptoms of lead poisoning, which include despair, anxiety, and changes in personality, had resulted in the creation of a ruler who was frequently unpredictable and occasionally deadly. The habit of applying cosmetics, which had been Elizabeth's rescue in the past, had now turned into a form of daily misery for her. Due to the fact that she was experiencing the tremors and muscle discomfort that are linked with lead poisoning, the application process, which required her to remain still for hours, became physically excruciating for her. However, she was unable to give up the cosmetics without also disclosing the degree to which her physical condition had deteriorated. Her skin had grown discolored and lesioned, and it looked more like parchment than human flesh. This was hidden beneath the layers of cosmetics that she wore. During the time that she was still alive, the toxic cosmetics had effectively mummified her face. The most unfortunate aspect of the situation was that Elizabeth appeared to comprehend what was being placed to her. Within the confines of private conversations with her most trusted ladies-in-waiting, she would discuss the sensation of being poisoned by beauty and express sorrow for the decisions that had led to her current state of affairs. Despite this, she felt as though she was unable to stand before her subjects without the intricate cosmetic alteration that was killing her. She felt as though she was stuck by the image that she had constructed. The Virgin Queen had become a captive of her own vanity, and she was helpless to break free from the vicious cycle of self-destruction that she had created for herself. Eventually, Elizabeth's decline began to have a negative impact on the kingdom itself. While the Queen suffered with disorientation or remained secluded in her chambers during her darkest episodes, significant decisions were postponed for weeks. This made it difficult for the Queen to make decisions. Elizabeth's mental health made it difficult for her to maintain the intricate diplomatic contacts that had helped England become a significant power in Europe. As a result, England's foreign policy became erratic. Once upon a time, the court was a hub of education. The culture of the English court evolved into a place where conversations were held in hushed tones and careful maneuvering was required to navigate around an increasingly unstable ruler. The beginning of Elizabeth I's ultimate spiral into the madness that would characterize her final months of life occurred during the winter of 1602. The cumulative effects of lead poisoning over the course of 4 decades had reached a critical threshold, resulting in symptoms that could no longer be concealed from even the most casual onlookers. It was difficult for the Queen, who had formerly been admired for her razor-sharp wit and political savvy, to carry on discussions that were intelligible. She frequently stopped in the middle of a sentence, as if she had forgotten what she was saying. As the woman who had defined an age slowly vanished before their own eyes, her courtiers looked in despair as she disappeared behind them. By far the most unsettling symptom of Elizabeth's deteriorating state was the fact that she became increasingly preoccupied with death and the occult. She began to claim seeing apparitions of individuals from her past, including her mother and Bullen, who had been executed, and her half-sister Mary Tudor, whom she had never seen before. These hallucinations, which modern medicine would recognize as symptoms of severe lead poisoning, convinced Elizabeth that she was being plagued by the ghosts of those who had suffered during Tudor rule. Elizabeth was certain that she was being haunted by death. She would spend hours apparently carrying on discussions with these ethereal guests, talking to empty chairs. She would spend hours chatting to empty chairs. The physical state of Elizabeth had deteriorated to a terrible degree. As a result of her natural skin being exposed to lead-based cosmetics for decades, it had become so damaged that it was no longer able to heal correctly. It was impossible for even the most potent perfumes to cover up the scent that emanated from her face and hands, which were covered with sores and ulcers. She was continually crying it out. What little hair she had left had turned fully white and fall out in clumps. Her hair had turned entirely white. Her teeth had started to turn black and fall out, which is a frequent symptom of mercury poisoning caused by the rouge she had worn for decades. This was the piece of information that shocked everyone the most. It used to take 4 hours to complete the cosmetics regimen, but now it takes entire days to finish it. In order to generate even the slightest resemblance of a human face, it was necessary to apply multiple layers of cosmetics. Furthermore, the process had to be repeated multiple times because the weight of the cosmetics caused them to crack and fall off. The ladies-in-waiting who worked for Elizabeth described the process of applying makeup that was so thick that it seemed more like a death mask than a cosmetic. The face of the queen had turned into a construction project, and it was being reconstructed every day from hazardous chemicals that were contributing to her gradual death. When Elizabeth was in her final months, she had a terrible realization about her situation, which was maybe the most heartbreaking aspect of her life. When she was able to regain consciousness, she was able to comprehend the events that had transpired in her life and conveyed a tremendous sense of sorrow for the decisions that had resulted in her current condition. She complained of being consumed by vanity and compared her face to a poison garden that had become more lethal with each passing year. She also described her face as a garden of poison. She had intervals of bewilderment and hallucinations that pointed to the fact that her brain was being systematically harmed by the heavy metals that were present in her system. These moments of insight were followed by periods of disorientation. As the queen's behavior got more and more irregular, she also demonstrated. The intense rages that she would have would cause her to toss objects and strike anyone who was within her reach. During a particularly unsettling episode, she was discovered in her chambers attempting to scrape the makeup off her face with her fingernails. It appeared that she was attempting to remove what she referred to as the poison mask. The wounds that resulted from this attempt took several weeks to heal and left permanent scars that required even more extensive applications of makeup. Even those who had been maintaining a close eye on Elizabeth's decline were taken aback when she made her last public appearance at the beginning of Parliament in November of 1602. There were witnesses who described a figure that was faintly like the famous Virgin Queen. The figure was propped up by exquisite attire and cosmetics, but it was obvious that it was dying. Due to the fact that her speech was slurred and entirely incomprehensible, she needed to be supported by courtiers in order to avoid falling. She had been reduced to a terrible spectacle, a living reminder of the price of vanity and the pitfalls of pursuing beauty at any cost. The woman who had once commanded the respect and terror of Europe's most powerful kings had been reduced to a tragic display. In the latter weeks of Elizabeth's life, as she lay dying in Richmond Palace, the queen's behavior took on an urgency that worried even her most seasoned courtiers. This occurred during the time that Elizabeth was in her terminal condition. Elizabeth became obsessed with writing what she called her final testament, a document that she worked on in secret, frequently during the early morning hours when the palace was quiet and her mind seemed to be clearest. This obsession persisted despite the fact that Elizabeth's physical condition was deteriorating and she was experiencing increasingly frequent episodes of confusion. Following her passing, this letter, which would be found among her things, will be found to contain revelations that were so upsetting that they were quickly concealed by her successor, James I. Catherine Carey, the Queen's most trusted lady-in-waiting, was the only person who was permitted to be present during the Queen's private writing sessions, which were held in her most private chamber. Later on, Carey recounted how she discovered Elizabeth bent over her writing desk, her hands violently shaking as she fought to form letters with a quill that appeared to be nearly too heavy for her to handle. The Queen's nervous system, which had been poisoned with lead, was so weak that she could not control her movements, and the act of writing itself had become excruciating for her. However, she continued to persevere with a dogged drive. Elizabeth's farewell letter was stunning because it was so brutally honest about the realities of her reign and the price she had paid for power. This was the reason why the letter was so disturbing. Elizabeth admitted to decades of deception, manipulation, and what she referred to as the slow suicide of vanity. Her confession was written in trembling handwriting that became increasingly illegible as her condition worsened. The document revealed that Elizabeth had been fully aware of the dangers of her cosmetic routine for years, but she had felt unable to abandon it without losing her political authority. She referred to the process of applying makeup on a daily basis as a type of beautiful self-murder, which she had chosen to do rather than the option of appearing in front of her subjects in her natural, damaged state. The letter made the most unsettling suggestion possible, which was that Elizabeth's cosmetic. It's possible that the poisoning wasn't so accidental after all. She wrote in a cryptic manner about people who would see her painted into her grave, and she made a veiled reference to the fact that certain members of her court had urged her to engage in increasingly risky beauty rituals, despite being fully aware of the potential adverse implications of these practices. The queen appeared to be under the impression that she had been the target of a slow-motion assassination that had been carried out not with daggers or poisoned cups, but rather via the meticulous manipulation of her vanity and insecurities. Additionally, Elizabeth included her own personal appraisal of the ways in which lead poisoning had impacted her reign in the letter. It was during her latter years that she admitted to making decisions that she could not remember and signing documents that she subsequently regretted. She attributed these mistakes to what she referred to as the fog of metal in my mind. She acknowledged to having moments of full blackouts, during which she had no recall of hours or even days, and during these times, she feared that people had ruled in her name without her knowledge or approval. This was the most disturbing thing of all. The final words that Elizabeth set down on paper were possibly the most heartbreaking of all. Her description of herself was that she had become a ghost that haunted her own kingdom, and she voiced tremendous sorrow for the sacrifices that she had made in order to achieve an unrealistic ideal of endless youth and beauty. As she came to the end of her reign, the lady who had given her name to an entire era admitted that she had ruined herself in order to serve an image that had never been true in the first place. The fact that James II and his advisors immediately suppressed this letter is evidence that the contents of the letter may potentially be explosive. The discovery that Elizabeth I, the greatest queen in England's history, had spent her final years deliberately poisoning herself while potentially being controlled by her own courtiers would have been enough to destroy the entire mythology that had developed around her reign. It was only through rumors and whispered reports of its contents that the true tragedy of Elizabeth's dying days could be suggested, despite the fact that the letter vanished into the royal archives, where it remained buried for generations. In a room that had become a monument to the vanity that had slowly killed her, Queen Elizabeth I took her final breath on March 24, 1603, in the early hours of a frigid spring morning. This room had become a monument to the vanity that had slowly killed her. The chamber in which she passed away was a distressing tableau of manufactured beauty and natural decay. It was replete with mirrors that reflected nothing but shadows and cosmetic utensils that were no longer able to conceal the truth about her situation. The woman who had once ruled the oceans and defeated the largest empire in Europe passed away by herself, with the exception of a few courtiers who were too scared to approach her bed. She was surrounded by the instruments of her own demise. The final weeks of Elizabeth's life had been a terrible mockery of the dignity that is associated with being a princess. She had been obliged to allow her ladies-in-waiting to paint her face each morning because she was unable to apply her normal intricate makeup due to the weakening in her hands. However, the outcome was more of a mask than a human visage, as the thick layers of substance that were poured over skin that was now more of a lesion than flesh. There was something about Ted's looks that was so unsettling that even her most devoted slaves found it impossible to look at her directly. A living memento mori, a reminder of mortality wrapped in the trappings of perpetual youth, the queen, who had once been admired for her beauty, had become someone who had become a living memento mori. When Elizabeth was in the throes of her death, the symptoms of acute lead poisoning, which had now reached a lethal level, rendered her last moments even more horrifying. She suffered from severe convulsions, which caused her meticulously placed makeup to crack and fall off in chunks, so exposing the scarred flesh that was underneath. Her breathing grew laborious and irregular, and she would abruptly sit up and speak to strangers. It seemed as though she was seeing the spirits that had haunted her in her final months with an increased regularity. Her respiration became strained and irregular. In the hours that followed, the courtiers who were present during Elizabeth's dying hours reported a spectacle that was almost supernaturally terrifying. At times, the dying queen's face appeared to alter and shift in the candlelight, sometimes like the lovely young woman she had once been, and other times displaying the poison-ravaged features that lay under decades of chemical disguise. The disintegrating queen's face was partially hidden by the remnants of her cosmetic mask. The iconic red wig that she wore had fallen off, exposing areas of her scalp that were damaged and discolored as a result of the toxic poisons that had been administered to them for 40 years. Elizabeth's final comments, which implied that even in death she remained trapped by the vanity that had killed her, were the most upsetting of all the things that she said before to her passing. Her last intelligible word was a request for a mirror, and it appears that she wanted to see her reflection for the very last time. This is according to the stories of those who were present. Her attendants were so appalled by her appearance that they were unable to comply with her request when a mirror was not brought. When Elizabeth became irritated, she attempted to lift her hands to her face as if she were trying to feel the features that she could no longer see. The last thing she did was touch her cheek, and as she did so, her fingers became soiled with the remnants of the cosmetics that had been her constant companion for the past 4 decades. The full scope of the deception that had shrouded Elizabeth's final years was brought to light in the immediate aftermath of her passing. The cosmetics had to be meticulously removed from her body before it could be readied for burial. This was done in order to expose skin that was so severely injured that it hardly resembled human flesh. There is a form of chemical mummification that had been caused by the lead-based cosmetics, which had preserved certain parts while having utterly destroyed others. It was observed by the undertakers that Elizabeth's natural hair had almost totally disappeared, that her teeth had become black stumps, and that her skin displayed the typical blue-gray discoloration that is often associated with chronic lead poisoning. A final horrifying dimension was added to the tragedy of Elizabeth's death when it was discovered that her hidden letter was among her belongings. With its revelations about the true cost of her beauty routine and its suggestions of possible manipulation by her courtiers, the document claimed that England's greatest monarch had been the victim of the longest and most intricate assassination in the history of the world. Who had made it through? Her reluctance to accept the natural process of aging, which was assisted and abetted by those who gained from her vanity and insecurity, had finally been the cause of the destruction of every external danger to her reign. The passing of Elizabeth not only signaled the conclusion of an era, but it also marked the beginning of one of the most successful cover-ups in the annals of history. Within a few days following the Queen's death, her successor, James I, issued an order to destroy the majority of the evidence that was related to her cosmetic practice and the harmful repercussions it caused. It was said that the official cause of death was merely natural causes, which was appropriate given her age. However, there was no mention of the fact that she had actually murdered herself over the course of several decades. Over the course of several centuries, the explosive contents of the secret letter that was discovered among her belongings were concealed from public view and eventually disappeared into the royal archives. The preservation of the myth of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, who was responsible for England's rise to prominence as a major European power, was James I and his advisors' top concern within the immediate time frame. Considering that Elizabeth was a mentally declining monarch who was progressively poisoning herself with hazardous cosmetics while likely being deceived by her own court, the reality of her latter years would have been enough to shatter the entire foundation of Tudor legitimacy. A story that was deliberately crafted arose instead, portraying Elizabeth's death as the tranquil departure of England's greatest monarch, surrounded by devoted subjects and secure in the knowledge that she had achieved her destiny. This narrative was a result of the thorough construction of a narrative. It was the concealing of the truth about Elizabeth's death that had far-reaching ramifications for the history of women and for the understanding of early modern cosmetics. However, despite the fact that some of the physicians and chemists of the time were aware of the potentially hazardous nature of lead-based makeup, this information was not widely communicated. This was in part due to the fact that Elizabeth's experience was deliberately concealed. In spite of the fact that they were following in the footsteps of a queen who had been slowly slain by her own beauty routine, a large number of other ladies continued to utilize these harmful drugs. One of the most effective propaganda techniques in the annals of English history was the idea of Elizabeth as the ageless Virgin Queen, who was perpetually young and lovely. A number of portraits that were commissioned after her passing continued to depict her with the flawless, pale skin that was generated by her cosmetics, rather than depicting her appearance in her natural state. Due to the fact that this idealized picture became so ingrained in the collective awareness of the general public, even contemporary historians have occasionally had difficulty distinguishing between the actual appearance of Elizabeth and the false image that she labored so meticulously to preserve. The psychological aspects of Elizabeth's tragedy have long-lasting ramifications for understanding the relationship between power, gender, and appearance in early modern Europe. These implications were a result of the dramatic events that occurred. It was revealed through her account that female rulers were placed in an untenable double bind. They were expected to preserve their beauty and desirability while exercising political control, but the exact cosmetics that they utilized to achieve these expectations may practically kill them. The death of Elizabeth was the culmination of a system's failure to function properly. A society that prioritized women's physical attractiveness over their health and overall well-being. It is possible that the prospect that Elizabeth's cosmetic poisoning had not been wholly accidental was the most unsettling of all the things that were mentioned in the covert letter that she had written. When it is suggested that courtiers had promoted her increasingly risky beauty routine while being aware of the harmful implications of the procedure, it raises issues about the nature of political assassination in the Tudor court. She would have been the victim of one of the most cunning and extended murders in the history of the world, carried out not with traditional weapons, but with the exploitation of pride and insecurity. If Elizabeth had been the victim of manipulation aimed to slowly incapacitate her, then this would be one of the most heinous crimes in history. It is possible that the true legacy of Elizabeth I's death is the example of how efficiently historical narratives can be controlled and manipulated. On the other hand, the evidence of her gradual poisoning remained hidden in archives and whispered stories for ages, while the official story of her dying away peacefully was accepted without question. Only in the most recent decades have historians started to piece together the facts of her dying years, presenting a story that is significantly more complicated and tragic than what the myth of Gloriana would suggest. It is important to remember that even the most powerful people are susceptible to the expectations and pressures of their time, and the terrifying final days of Elizabeth serve as a reminder of this sensitivity. The Virgin Queen, who had survived every external challenge to her reign, was ultimately undone by forces that manifested themselves from within. Her own vanity, the unattainable demands of early modern femininity, and possibly the manipulation of those whom she trusted the most. It was not only the end of the Tudor dynasty that her death represented, but it also marked the end of one of the most extended and sad self-destructions in the history of the world. Her death was carried out one cosmetic application at a time over the course of 40 years of her life. After all was said and done, Elizabeth I passed away in the same manner in which she had lived. She spent her final decades ensnared in a mask that she had fashioned herself, poisoned by the same poisons that she believed would preserve her authority, and isolated by the deceptions that were required to keep up an image that had long since failed to reflect reality. The woman who had given her name to an age became its victim, surrendering her life on the altar of an unrealistic ideal of endless youth and beauty that no mortal, not even a queen, could ever fully accomplish. She had given her name to an age that eventually became her own.